In October 2004, Claire Whitman, a 31-year-old elementary school teacher from Logan, Utah, vanished on her way home from a late parent-teacher meeting. She was last seen driving her green Ford Explorer out of the school parking lot. She never made it home. The next morning, Claire's classroom sat empty. Her 7-year-old daughter was left waiting at school with no one to pick her up. Alarmed and desperate, her family contacted police immediately. Officers launched an urgent search, sweeping roads, neighborhoods, and the area around Bear River. At 9:40 p.m. on the night of her disappearance, a fisherman reported seeing an SUV heading toward the lake. Investigators focused their search there, but nothing surfaced. Days turned into weeks. With no vehicle, no body, and no solid evidence, the case stalled. Attention quickly turned to Claire's boyfriend, Brian Keller, a local plumber. Neighbors said arguments between the two were common. That night, Claire had called her best friend, frightened, and whispered, "Brian is following me." When questioned, Brian gave shifting accounts. At one point, he claimed Claire wanted space. Another time, he said she left town to visit friends. None of his statements matched. Suspicion grew when records showed Brian collected $250,000 from a life insurance policy Claire had taken out months earlier. But without proof of a crime, authorities had nothing to hold him on. In 2006, the case was officially labeled a cold case. For 16 years, the Whitman family held candlelight vigils by Bear River. The community remained divided. Some believed Claire had walked away. Others were convinced Brian was responsible. Then, in 2020, everything changed. A volunteer search team used sonar to scan the depths of Bear River. They detected an unusual shape buried in the mud. Divers went down and confirmed it, a green Ford Explorer, almost intact. Inside, investigators found Claire's belongings, dried blood, and crucial DNA evidence. The discovery reopened one of Utah's most haunting disappearances. A cold case thought unsolvable now held the potential to reveal. Claire Whitman was 31 years old in the fall of 2004. She lived in Logan, Utah, a quiet community surrounded by mountains and farmland. She worked as an elementary school teacher at Logan Elementary, where her colleagues described her as dedicated and disciplined. She expected her students to pay attention, but she also cared deeply for them. Parents remembered how she often stayed after class to help a child struggling with reading, or how she organized small weekend projects so her students could build confidence outside the classroom. Her role in the community went beyond teaching. Claire regularly joined church activities, volunteered in food drives, and was known for showing up whenever there was a local fundraiser. To neighbors, she seemed steady and reliable. People trusted her. That made what happened to her even harder to believe. Claire was also a mother. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Emily. Raising a child alone was not easy, but she managed it with discipline and routine. She took extra shifts and evening classes, sometimes staying late at school just to cover expenses. She was careful with money, cautious with her time, and structured in how she planned her week. Her neighbors remembered seeing her walk with Emily around the block in the evenings, hand in hand, talking quietly as they passed. Those small walks became a regular sight in the neighborhood. Her relationship with her own mother was also close. Claire almost always called her after finishing her workday, even if it was just a short check-in. It was a habit her mother noticed and depended on. When those calls suddenly stopped in October 2004, it was one of the first red flags that something was seriously wrong. But behind the surface of a stable life, there were tensions. Claire had been in a relationship with a man named Brian Keller. He was 36, a plumber who ran a small repair shop in town. The two lived together, though they were not married. At first, it seemed like a practical arrangement, two adults sharing expenses and responsibilities. But the relationship was far from steady. Neighbors later told police they had heard shouting between Claire and Brian on more than one occasion. The arguments, they said, were loud and intense, sometimes late at night. The tension grew worse in the weeks before she vanished. During the first week of October, Claire confided to her best friend, Laura Mitchell, that she felt like she was being followed. She didn't give details, but her voice carried fear. Laura later recalled that Claire seemed nervous and distracted, checking over her shoulder more often, as though expecting someone to appear. It was an unease that others began to notice, too. On October 12, 2004, Claire attended a late parent-teacher conference at the school. It was a long day, and she wrapped up around 9 o'clock. As she walked to her car, she made a call to Laura. Her tone was different that night, shaken and urgent. She said, "Brian is following me. I'm scared." That was the last time anyone heard her voice. The timeline from that evening is chilling in its simplicity. At 9:15 p.m., a security camera at the school recorded Claire leaving the parking lot in her green Ford Explorer. 25 minutes later at 9:40 p.m., a fisherman near Bear River noticed a vehicle matching that description, heading toward the water. After that, nothing. The next morning, Claire's classroom sat empty. Her daughter Emily waited at school with no one arriving to pick her up. That was entirely out of character. Claire had never once failed to collect her daughter or notify someone in advance. Alarmed, her family contacted the police immediately. Investigators launched a rapid search. They combed the roads between the school and her home, they checked rural routes, and they searched the area surrounding Bear River. But there was no vehicle, no sign of Claire, and no immediate evidence to follow. Attention quickly turned to Brian Keller. Police questioned him within hours. His statements, however, were inconsistent. First, he told them Claire had left the house after an argument to get fresh air. Later, he claimed she had sent him a message saying she needed space and might visit friends in Salt Lake City. But no such message was ever confirmed, and the phone records didn't support his claims. Witnesses from the neighborhood added to the doubts. Several reported hearing yet another argument between Claire and Brian in the days before she vanished. For the Whitman family, the pain grew heavier with time. Claire's mother kept calling for answers, organizing vigils by Bear River each year. Her daughter Emily grew up in silence, burdened by questions no one could answer. For the community of Logan, the case became an open wound. Some whispered that Claire had chosen to leave her life behind. Others were convinced Brian had done something to her. But with no evidence, those theories remained only speculation. The story of Claire Whitman became one of Utah's most haunting mysteries. A responsible teacher, a devoted mother, a woman with ties to her church and community, vanished in the span of a single night. The case froze in place, suspended in uncertainty, until technology and persistence finally brought movement again, more than a decade later. October 12, 2004. It was a long day at Logan Elementary School in northern Utah. Parent-teacher conferences stretched into the evening. Teachers stayed late answering questions, reviewing grades, and reassuring anxious parents. Among them was 31-year-old Claire Whitman. By the end of the night, she was tired, but still wrapping up papers, sliding her lesson plans into her bag. Around 9 o'clock, the conference ended. Claire lingered a few minutes in her classroom organizing her materials. A colleague remembered seeing her step out at about 9:10 p.m. The teacher later told investigators that Claire looked tense, holding her phone tightly as she left. It was unusual. Claire was normally composed. That image, walking out of the empty hallway, looking worried, became the last memory her coworkers had of her. At 9:15 p.m., security footage captured her in the school parking lot. The grainy video showed Claire walking to her green Ford Explorer. She unlocked the driver's side door, got inside, and started the engine. The SUV pulled away, headlights briefly illuminating the pavement, before disappearing into the darkness. The camera did not record anything suspicious in the background, but the lighting was poor, and investigators later admitted that the footage revealed little beyond her departure. Shortly after she left the lot, Claire made a phone call. She dialed her best friend, Laura Mitchell. At 9:40 p.m., another sighting surfaced. A local fisherman was out near Bear River, preparing his gear along the waterline. He noticed headlights in the distance, a vehicle, dark-colored, moving toward the lakeshore. He paid attention because the road near the river was rarely used at that hour. He later told police the car looked like an SUV, green or dark blue. It drove toward the water and never came back. He didn't hear a splash. He didn't hear a struggle. Just the steady hum of an engine fading away. That sighting, later matched to the timeline of Claire's Ford Explorer, became the last independent confirmation of her movements. After 10 p.m., Claire's phone went silent. Cell tower records showed no more activity. The signal dropped off completely. Investigators would later confirm that her device had either been switched off or destroyed. For the rest of the night, there were no additional witnesses. No traffic cameras along the rural roads picked up the SUV. Logan in 2004 did not have extensive surveillance systems. Once the car left the school and moved toward the river, it simply vanished. The following morning, the first signs of alarm appeared. At 7:30 a.m., students arrived at Logan Elementary. They waited outside Claire's classroom, expecting her as usual. But the classroom was dark, her desk empty. By 8 o'clock, when the school day began, it was clear something was wrong. Claire had never once failed to appear without calling in. That afternoon, the alarm spread closer to home. At 3 p.m., her daughter Emily was left waiting at her own school. Claire had not come to pick her up. Teachers tried contacting her phone. No answer. They eventually called Claire's mother, who rushed over, confused and frantic. Within the hour, the family contacted police. A missing person report was filed before the sun set. Logan police moved quickly. By evening, officers had already searched Claire's home. They found nothing out of place. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Her belongings, wallet, and personal papers remained where they should have been. To detectives, the absence of evidence inside the home was troubling. It suggested officers pressed for more detail. Brian's story shifted. He suggested that maybe she wanted to leave Logan entirely, that she had mentioned visiting friends in Salt Lake City. Later, he claimed she had sent him a text saying she needed space. But when investigators checked her phone records, there was no such message. None of his accounts held up under scrutiny. By the end of the first 24 hours, detectives faced a troubling set of facts. Claire left school at 9:15. She called her friend within minutes, expressing fear of Brian. At 9:40, her car was likely seen heading toward the river. By 10 o'clock, her phone was dead. The next day, she failed to appear at school, and her daughter was left alone. All signs pointed to danger. Yet there was no car, no body, and no crime scene. In those early hours, the search widened. Police units patrolled the banks of Bear River. They brought in dogs to track potential scent trails, but nothing emerged. Helicopters scanned the waterline, but again, there was no evidence. The river and its surrounding marshes were vast. Without a precise location, the search was like looking for a needle in a field of grass. Detectives concluded that the last confirmed moment of Claire's life was that 9:40 p.m. sighting, a green SUV heading toward Bear River. After that, silence. The missing teacher's case moved quickly from unusual absence to suspected foul play. Investigators no longer believed Claire had left by choice. They believed she had been intercepted or forced off the road. Suspicion centered on Brian, but without physical evidence, it was only suspicion. Within 2 days, the story spread across Logan. Parents, students, and neighbors asked the same questions. How could a teacher, a mother, a familiar face in the community, vanish in less than an hour? Why did her car disappear along with her? The first phase of the investigation closed with no resolution. Police knew the timeline, they knew the warnings, they knew Claire's fear was real. But the lack of hard evidence left them with little more than a haunting sequence of times. 9:15 she left the school. 9:20 the call for help. 9:40 the sighting near Bear River. And then, nothing. By early afternoon, they had extended the search to Bear River, the area where a fisherman claimed to have seen an SUV matching her vehicle the night before. Police brought in K-9 units to walk the shoreline. Dogs were released into the brush, their handlers calling out her name, but nothing turned up. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the water with spotlights. No tire marks, no signs of impact. No trace of a vehicle going into the lake. It looked like the river had swallowed the evidence whole, and the first critical hours slipped away. Local news stations picked up the story by evening. The disappearance of a respected school teacher in a small Utah town was the kind of case that rattled people fast. Reporters showed images of Claire's classroom, the desk where she hadn't appeared that morning, and the growing search effort along the shoreline. The headlines were blunt. Teacher missing. Vehicle still unfound. While search teams scoured the area, investigators began speaking to the people closest to Claire. The first name on their list was her live-in boyfriend, Brian Keller. Brian's initial statement was short. He said they had argued that evening. Claire left the house upset, telling him she needed some air. He suggested she might have gone for a drive to cool off. His tone was calm, almost casual, as though her absence was not unusual. But detectives noticed the indifference. His partner had not come home, her daughter was stranded at school, and he seemed unconcerned. The next day, Brian's story shifted. This time he told police that Claire had left to visit a friend in Salt Lake City. He implied she might have been planning a break. Officers pressed him. Which friend? Where exactly did she say she was going? He had no details, no name, no address. When investigators checked Claire's family and friends, no one knew of such a trip. Days later, his account changed again. Now he claimed Claire had sent him a text message saying she needed space and wanted to get away from Logan. But when police subpoenaed her phone records, no such text existed. The phone had gone dark just after 10 p.m. the night she vanished. There was no digital record of a goodbye. Then came the fisherman. He confirmed to police that at 9:40 p.m. he had seen an SUV, possibly green, driving toward Bear River. He told them it never returned. He didn't hear a crash, didn't see headlights in the water, but the car vanished into the darkness. His statement aligned almost perfectly with the timeline from the school and the phone call. Neighbors added more weight. Several told officers they had heard arguments between Claire and Brian in the weeks before she went missing. Some described shouting so loud it carried through the walls. One neighbor recalled the sound of glass breaking during one of their fights. Another said, "It wasn't just yelling. You could hear anger. Real anger." All of it pointed toward the same man, but evidence still lagged behind suspicion. Then came the first outside tip. A letter arrived at the police station, unsigned, warning detectives that Brian was drowning in gambling debt. The writer claimed he owed money to several local bookies and was under pressure. Police began digging into his finances. They quickly learned the claim was true. Bank records showed overdue payments, credit cards maxed out, a pattern of cash withdrawals tied to betting habits. More importantly, they discovered that only months earlier, Claire had taken out a life insurance policy worth $250,000. The beneficiary was Brian Keller. Now investigators had motive: a man in debt, a partner insured for a large sum, a relationship marked by conflict, and a disappearance that left behind no trace. It was enough to put Brian under a microscope, but still, no body, no car, and no crime scene. Detectives could not move forward with charges. The search for Claire's Ford Explorer became the centerpiece of the case. Police organized multiple sweeps of Bear River. Boats circled the water, dragging sonar equipment far less advanced than what would come years later. Divers went down, battling thick mud and poor visibility. They returned with nothing. "It's like searching blind," one diver admitted. "Once you go under, you can't see more than a few feet in front of you." After several weeks, the official search was scaled back. The vehicle was never. Those delays, small on their own, added up. For Claire's family, they were devastating. Her mother pleaded with police outside the station. "She called me almost every night," she told reporters. "For her to just vanish without a word. It's impossible." Someone knows what happened. But the answers never came. The pressure mounted as media coverage intensified. Newspapers ran front-page stories with her picture, a smiling young teacher with her daughter by her side. Reporters questioned how a woman and her car could vanish in a small town. Editorials asked why police had not been able to find even a single piece of the SUV. Community opinion split. Some believed Claire had chosen to walk away, overwhelmed by stress. Others pointed firmly at Brian. Parents from the school rallied to organize vigils, holding candles by Bear River and demanding answers. One of them told a local station, "We're not letting her memory fade. This is our town. We want to know the truth." Inside the Logan Police Department, the case grew colder by the week. Leads slowed. Witness interviews repeated the same details. Brian remained under suspicion, but prosecutors refused to proceed without physical evidence. The district attorney's office made it clear: speculation wasn't enough. By 2006, nearly 2 years after Claire disappeared, the investigation was officially classified as a cold case. Detective Michael Harper, who had led the effort, spoke to reporters in a restrained tone. "We have a suspect. We have motive. We have conflicting statements. But without direct evidence, our hands are tied. In the eyes of the law, that isn't enough." The announcement crushed the family. For Claire's mother, it felt like the system had given up. For her daughter Emily, only 9 years old by then, it meant growing up without answers. The Bear River case became a haunting presence in Logan. A teacher vanished. A boyfriend with motive walked free. A community left with rumors, suspicions, and no resolution. And all the while the Ford Explorer lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the day technology would finally expose it. By 2006, the investigation into Claire Whitman's disappearance had stalled. For Claire's mother, that explanation was unbearable. She kept sending petitions to the Logan Police Department and to state authorities, begging them not to let her daughter's case be forgotten. Every October, on the anniversary of the disappearance, she organized a candlelight vigil on the shores of Bear River. Families, teachers, and neighbors came, holding candles in the dark. In the front row was Claire's daughter, Emily, only a child, clutching a candle taller than her hands. That image, a little girl sitting by the water with tears in her eyes, became a lasting memory in Logan. Emily grew up in silence. She was 7 when her mother vanished, 9 when the case was declared cold, and a teenager when she realized the truth might never come out. She rarely spoke to reporters, but classmates remembered her leaving school early on the anniversary, sitting quietly by the lake. The community understood what that absence meant. Rumors filled the space that evidence should have occupied. Some believed Claire had run away. They whispered that maybe she had been desperate to escape Brian Keller and simply disappeared into a new life. Others were sure Brian was responsible but had found a way to cover his tracks. Both theories circulated for years, repeated in coffee shops, classrooms, and town meetings. The local paper, the Logan Herald-Journal, occasionally revisited the case. Each time the headline was the same: The Bear River Mystery. But speculation was not evidence. There were attempts to revive the search. In 2008, a group of volunteers brought metal detectors and scanning equipment to the lake. They combed the shoreline, convinced they might find a trace of the missing SUV. They found nothing. 4 years later, in 2012, police partnered with a private dive team. The divers braved the muddy water, sinking into darkness where visibility was only a few inches. They returned empty-handed. "It was like diving blind," one diver told the press. "You know something could be down there, but you just can't see it." Both efforts gave the family hope for a moment. Both ended in disappointment. Still, every October 12th, Logan remembered. People gathered by the water with candles and prayers. The elementary school, several witnesses had told police they saw Brian Keller near the lake in the weeks after the disappearance. He offered different excuses each time. Sometimes he was going fishing, other times walking the dog. The sightings fueled suspicion, but no evidence tied him directly to the crime. The anonymous tip about his gambling debts and the life insurance policy still hung over him. People in Logan knew Brian had benefited from Claire's absence. He had collected the $250,000 payout. He had moved on with his business. To many, that was proof enough. But in court, suspicion alone was nothing. By the late 2000s, the case was barely more than a story parents told their kids. Officers who had once worked the file had retired or transferred. Detective Michael Harper, who had led the original investigation, admitted later, "We never stopped caring, but the tools we had back then just weren't enough." By 2019, the case was all but frozen. Claire's file sat in a row of boxes marked unsolved, stacked against the walls of the cold case unit. The officers still assigned to it reviewed the notes, but nothing new ever emerged. No tips, no breakthroughs. For the family, hope had nearly drained away. Even the local newspaper had stopped covering the anniversary vigil. And then, out of nowhere, the story returned. In early 2020, a group of volunteer searchers brought sonar equipment to Bear River. They weren't police. They weren't professionals. They were hobbyists, citizens who spent weekends scanning lakes for missing cars. Their technology was far more advanced than what investigators had used in 2004 or 2012. With high-resolution sonar, they could map the lake bed in detail. Within days, the volunteers spotted something unusual. A large object, buried deep in silt, shaped like a vehicle. They marked the coordinates and alerted authorities. At first, police were skeptical. Over the years, they had received countless false leads. But this time was different. When divers went down, they confirmed what the sonar had shown. Resting under 16 years of mud and water was a green Ford Explorer. The license plate matched Claire Whitman's car. The mystery that had haunted Logan for In early 2020, a volunteer search and recovery team arrived in Logan, Utah. They specialized in finding missing vehicles in lakes and rivers. Over the years, they had solved dozens of cases that police had given up on. This time, their focus was Bear River. The team brought with them state-of-the-art sonar equipment. Unlike the tools available in 2004, this new technology could scan the entire lake bed in high resolution. It could reveal shapes hidden beneath layers of mud that the human eye, or even divers, would never detect. At first, the trip was routine. The volunteers had no guarantee they would find anything. The case of Claire Whitman had been cold for 16 years. Many in Logan assumed it would remain unsolved forever. But within hours of scanning the waters, everything changed. On the sonar screen, the operator saw a large rectangular object. It was buried under thick silt, resting near the deeper end of the lake. The outline was too clean to be a natural formation. One of the volunteers later said, "The moment we saw it, we knew it was a car." The discovery was immediately reported to Logan police. At first, the police were skeptical. They had conducted numerous searches of the lake in the past with no results. Helicopters, cadaver dogs, and even divers had been deployed between 2004 and 2006. All those efforts had ended in failure. Now they were being told that a group of civilians had succeeded where law enforcement had not. But the sonar images were undeniable. A vehicle was there. Police had no choice but to take action. They approved a dive mission within 24 hours. Divers entered the murky waters of Bear River. Visibility was almost zero. Mud clung to everything, reducing sight to inches. The divers used touch more than vision to confirm what the sonar had shown. And then they felt it. Cold metal. The frame of a vehicle, submerged for more than a decade. When the mud was cleared from the license plate, the numbers were still visible. They matched the plate registered to Claire Whitman's Ford Explorer. 16 years after her disappearance, her car had finally been found. The recovery took hours. Heavy machinery pulled the SUV slowly from the water. As it broke the surface, a crowd of residents and reporters gasped. The green Ford Explorer was rusted, battered, but unmistakable. For Logan, it was the first real lead since 2004. Inside the vehicle, investigators made a series of critical discoveries. Claire's wallet was still there. Her teaching planner, soaked but recognizable, lay on the passenger seat. Personal belongings, small items only Claire would have carried, were preserved in the mud. But the most important findings were not objects. On the fabric of the driver's seat and the floor mat, investigators collected dried stains. Laboratory testing confirmed they were human blood. DNA analysis provided the result that everyone feared but expected. It belonged to Claire. This alone changed the entire direction of the case. For years, some believed Claire had left voluntarily, but the presence of her blood inside the car destroyed that theory. Something violent had happened to her. The investigation went deeper. On the steering wheel and trunk handle, technicians found fingerprints. Several prints matched Brian Keller. He had long denied being inside Claire's SUV on the night she vanished. Now, evidence proved otherwise. Then came the most puzzling discovery. On the rear seat of the vehicle, DNA from an unknown individual was found. It did not match Claire. It did not match Brian. It belonged to someone else. This raised an unsettling possibility. A third person may have been involved. Forensic experts stressed the significance of these results. Blood, fingerprints, and DNA were physical, undeniable. Unlike testimony or suspicion, they could not be explained away easily. The evidence tied Brian Keller to the vehicle and to Claire's disappearance. And the unknown DNA hinted at hidden details that even investigators had not considered. The next step was financial analysis. With renewed interest, the FBI joined the case. They combed through Brian Keller's banking history. What they uncovered added another layer to the story. Records showed that in October 2004, just days after Claire vanished, Brian transferred a large sum of money to his longtime friend, Todd Jensen. The timing raised alarm. Why would Brian move thousands of dollars immediately after Claire went missing? And why to Todd, a man with no known connection to Claire herself? FBI agents subpoenaed more documents. They discovered Todd's debts had been cleared shortly after receiving the money. When combined with the vehicle evidence, this transaction painted a troubling picture. Brian may not have acted alone. For years, Logan police had been accused of giving up too quickly. They had lacked the resources to explore the bottom of Bear River. They had declared the case cold by 2006. But in 2020, with new technology and federal assistance, the investigation had life again. Detective Michael Harper, who had handled the case in its early days, returned to oversee the reopening of the file. He admitted to the press, "We always suspected Brian. But without the car, without the DNA, there was nothing we could hold in court. Now, we finally have what we need." The news spread across Logan like wildfire. For the Whitman family, it was a moment of both grief and relief. Claire's daughter, now a young woman, told reporters, "I grew up not knowing what happened to my mom. This is the first time I feel like we might finally get answers." The community gathered again by Bear River, this time not for a memorial, but to watch investigators pull the vehicle from the lake. Residents described the scene as surreal. One man said, "It was like seeing a ghost come back after 16 years." The pressure on law enforcement mounted instantly. People wanted arrests. They wanted accountability. For years, Brian Keller had walked free, run. As detectives reviewed the evidence, the case against him grew stronger. His fingerprints in the car contradicted his long-standing alibi. The financial records showed suspicious payments to Todd Jensen, and Todd himself, when questioned, struggled to explain the sudden influx of money. In late 2020, prosecutors began preparing charges. The evidence was turned over to the Utah Attorney General's office. Every item, the DNA, the fingerprints, the bank transfers, was cataloged for trial. Forensic specialists emphasized that sonar technology had made this possible. Without it, Claire's vehicle would still be buried, her case still cold. One expert told the media, "This is why technology matters. It gives the dead a voice." Logan police faced tough questions from reporters. Why had volunteers, not officers, been the ones to find the car? Why wasn't sonar used earlier? Did law enforcement fail Claire by declaring the case unsolvable so quickly? Detective Harper acknowledged the criticism. He admitted, "If we had today's tools back then, this case might have been solved years ago." For the Whitman family, that admission stung. 16 years of silence, grief, and unanswered questions might have been avoided. Still, the evidence recovered in 2020 could not be ignored. It was decisive. It reopened a case many thought was buried forever. By November, investigators placed Brian Keller under close surveillance. Unmarked cars followed him. Wiretaps were approved. His every move was monitored as prosecutors built their case. The community was divided. Some argued that the evidence was overwhelming and Brian was guilty. Others insisted the unknown DNA suggested another suspect, maybe someone who had never been considered. Coffee shops, church meetings, and local diners buzzed with speculation. In living rooms across Logan, people asked the same question. Would this finally end the mystery of Bear River? For the first time in years, the Whitman case was no longer a forgotten file in a dusty cabinet. It was active, it was urgent, and it was about to lead to an arrest. November 2020. After 16 long years of unanswered questions, the Bear River mystery finally reached a breaking point. It was a cold morning in Logan when officers surrounded Keller's small plumbing shop. The timing was deliberate. Investigators wanted him in public view where there could be no denial, no escape, and plenty of witnesses. Customers stood frozen as uniformed officers marched through the shop. Within minutes, Keller was handcuffed in front of his employees. The man who had lived in Logan for decades, who had fixed leaking pipes in family homes, who had cheered at Little League games, was led out the front door in shackles. Reporters and news crews had already been tipped off. Cameras rolled as Keller was placed in the back of a squad car. The image hit the front pages within hours. Brian Keller, the man many had suspected for years, finally under arrest. The shock was immediate. Logan was a quiet community where neighbors knew each other's names. A public arrest in broad daylight, broadcast across Utah, was something few could have imagined. Later that same day, attention shifted to the outskirts of Logan, where Todd Jensen lived in a modest home on a quiet street. Officers arrived mid-afternoon. Todd didn't resist. He stood on his porch as agents showed him the warrant. Neighbors peeked through curtains as Jensen, a man most described as quiet and unremarkable, was escorted into a waiting car. Inside his home, investigators seized bank records and documents. These records matched transfers Keller had made in 2004, money that appeared suddenly within days of Claire's disappearance. Todd didn't say much at first. He asked for a lawyer. He waited in silence as the evidence was laid out in front of him. The DNA, the fingerprints, the discovery of the explorer, the suspicious bank transfer. The weight of 16 years of suspicion bore down in a single interrogation room. What broke the silence was the detail only someone present could know. During questioning, Todd's resolve cracked. He admitted Keller had called him on the night of October 12, 2004. The words stuck with investigators. "She's not coming back. When word reached the Whitman family, the emotions were overwhelming. Claire's mother, who had held candlelight vigils every October for 16 years, wept openly when police told her Keller was in custody. She told reporters, "We waited nearly 20 years to hear these words. Justice has finally begun." Claire's daughter, Emily, now 23, had grown up in the shadow of the case. She never knew her mother beyond faint childhood memories. For her, the arrest brought clarity. "I grew up in darkness. At least now I know my mom never walked away. She didn't leave me." Those words echoed across Logan, carried by newspapers and television reports. It was a moment of truth, long overdue. Logan wasn't a city used to crime on this scale. For years, residents had debated whether Claire had run away or met a darker fate. The arrests ended that debate, but the revelations were deeply unsettling. The man at the center of it all, Brian Keller, was no outsider. He was the neighbor down the street, the man seen at community barbecues, the person fixing sinks and water heaters across town. He had coached children's softball. He had sat at church services on Sundays. Neighbors expressed disbelief. One told the press, "We always thought he was hot-tempered, sure, but to be tied to this. I never believed it until I saw him in handcuffs." But not everyone agreed. Some residents pointed to the mysterious third DNA sample found in the Explorer. They questioned whether Keller was the only person responsible. The community was divided, some ready to close the chapter, others convinced the full truth was still hidden. The story spread quickly beyond Logan. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with live reports. State newspapers printed headlines like, "Bear River Mystery Breaks Open, Boyfriend Arrested After 16 Years." Within days, national outlets picked it up. True crime programs announced special episodes. Online forums lit up with speculation, dissecting every detail of the newly revealed evidence. For the first time in years, Claire Whitman's name was on the front page across the country. The case became more than a local tragedy. By December 2020, formal charges were filed. Brian Keller was indicted for second-degree murder. Todd Jensen was charged as an accomplice for tampering with evidence and obstructing justice. At a press conference, the prosecutor stood before a wall of microphones. "We have DNA. We have financial records. We have testimony. This is not speculation. This is proof," he declared. Inside the courtroom, Keller's defense attorney countered quickly. He argued there was no body, no official cause of death, no absolute certainty. "All we have are assumptions and desperation to close an old file," he told reporters. The defense pointed again and again to the unknown DNA profile found in the Explorer. "There is a third person unaccounted for," they insisted. "Until that person is identified, this case is incomplete." Those words echoed in the public debate. Was Keller guilty beyond doubt? Or was there still a missing piece no one had uncovered? In Logan, anticipation grew. Every coffee shop conversation, every church gathering, every local news segment circled back to one question. Would Keller finally be convicted? For the Whitman family, it was never about speculation. To them, the DNA, the fingerprints, the financial trail, and Todd's confession were enough. They had lived through years of silence. They wanted closure, not theories. Emily said quietly in one interview, "For so long, people told me maybe my mom just left. Maybe she ran away. But now I know. She didn't leave me. She was taken." Her voice shook, but her words were steady. They struck at the heart of the case. The months leading to trial were filled with tension. Keller remained in custody, denied bail after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk. Todd Jensen, facing lesser charges, was held in the county jail while awaiting trial. The Whitman family prepared themselves for the legal battle ahead. They knew cross-examinations would be brutal, that the defense would question every detail. But they also knew that after 16 years, their voices would finally be heard in court. Reporters framed it as the climax of the Bear River mystery. The town of Logan, as 2020 came to a close, Logan was caught between disbelief and anticipation. People drove past Bear River and stopped to stare at the water, now infamous as the hiding place of Clare's explorer. Candlelight vigils grew larger, drawing people from outside the county. The Bear River mystery had always been part of local folklore. Now it was on the verge of being resolved in a court of law. Brian Keller sat in his cell, insisting he was innocent. Todd Jensen sat in another cell, haunted by the night he pushed the explorer into the water. And the Whitman family sat in their home, holding on to the hope that the next year would finally bring justice. The stage was set. The trial was coming. And the truth, at least the truth the evidence could prove, was about to be tested before a jury. March 2021, nearly 17 years after the disappearance of Claire Whitman, the case that haunted Logan, Utah finally entered a courtroom. Inside the Cache County Courthouse, 12 jurors took their seats. They were not just facing another trial. They were asked to decide the fate of a man accused of ending Claire's life and burying the truth at the bottom of a lake. Reporters filled the gallery. Television crews lined the sidewalks outside. Locals stood in long lines for a chance to watch history unfold. Logan was a small community, a place where most crimes involved burglary, small disputes, or the occasional drunk driving case. Now it was the stage for a trial that drew national attention. The defendant, Brian Keller, sat at the defense table in a gray suit. Once the owner of a plumbing business, once seen as just another face in the crowd, he was now charged with second-degree murder. Beside him, his old friend Todd Jensen faced charges of being an accomplice and helping cover up the crime. The prosecution opened firmly. The lead prosecutor walked to the jury box holding up a photograph of the Ford Explorer pulled from Bear River. He described how sonar, diving teams, and DNA analysis had uncovered evidence that had been hidden for 16 years. He told the jury, this was not a case built on speculation. It was built on science, testimony. The defense countered quickly. Brian's lawyer leaned on one central theme: absence of a body, absence of proof. He reminded jurors that no remains had ever been found. Without a body, he argued, you cannot know the cause of death. You cannot even prove death beyond doubt. He pointed to the unidentified DNA on the back seat, suggesting the possibility of another person, a third man, as he called it, who could have played a role. He told the jury that Todd Jensen was the real manipulator, cutting a deal to save himself and throwing Brian under the bus. The first witnesses were called. Laura Mitchell, Claire's closest friend, walked to the stand. She looked directly at the jury and recalled the phone call she received on the night of October 12, 2004. Claire's voice, she said, was panicked and shaking. Brian is following me. I'm scared. That was the last time anyone ever heard her alive. The defense tried to cast doubt on Laura's memory, asking if she was certain about the words after so many years. Laura never wavered. She said she remembered every second because it was burned into her mind. Next came the fisherman who had been at Bear River that night. He testified that he saw a dark SUV, green or blue, heading toward the lake around 9:40 p.m. He never saw it leave. At the time, he thought little of it. Years later, When the vehicle was pulled from the water, he realized what he had witnessed. His calm but firm voice gave weight to a timeline that matched Claire's last known movements. Several neighbors also testified. They described loud arguments between Claire and Brian, sometimes lasting into the night. One recalled hearing shouting and the sound of something heavy hitting the floor just days before Claire disappeared. None of them had seen violence directly, but the pattern of conflict painted a picture of tension that matched the prosecution's claim of a relationship on the edge. The centerpiece of the trial came when forensic experts presented their findings. They displayed images of the Ford Explorer, caked in mud, but intact after 16 years underwater. They showed photographs of dried blood on the driver's seat and floorboard, confirmed through DNA testing as belonging to Claire. They pointed to fingerprints lifted from the steering wheel and the rear hatch, matched to Brian Keller. One expert told the jury that the car could not have rolled into the lake on its own. Its transmission was in park. Its parking brake was engaged. To end up where it did, someone had to push it or tow it. That testimony destroyed any suggestion of an accident. Then came the question of the unidentified DNA on the back seat. The prosecution acknowledged it openly. They had run it through national databases and found no match. But, they argued, the presence of an unknown profile did not erase the mountain of evidence pointing directly to Brian. The tension in the courtroom rose when Todd Jensen took the stand. Facing his own charges, Todd had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. He admitted that Brian called him around midnight on the night Claire vanished. Brian's voice, he said, was panicked and urgent. "She's not coming back. I need your help." Todd told the jury how he met Brian near Bear River, how they pushed the Ford Explorer into the water together, and how he accepted money afterward as payment for his silence. The defense attacked Todd's credibility relentlessly. They painted him as a liar desperate to save himself, willing to invent details to reduce his prison time. They asked why he had stayed silent for 16 years. They questioned why his story only emerged after the car was found and the evidence stacked up. But the jury listened closely. Todd's testimony, combined with the physical evidence, gave the prosecution a direct narrative of what happened that night. The defense tried another strategy. They emphasized the missing body. They argued that without remains, the state could not prove Claire was dead, let alone that Brian caused her death. They reminded jurors that people had disappeared before and started new lives elsewhere. They questioned whether Claire, a single mother under pressure, could have walked away. But that argument rang hollow when weighed against the blood in the car. The trial stretched on for weeks. Every day reporters filed stories, and every evening the people of Logan gathered in small groups to debate the case. Some believed Brian's guilt was clear. Others clung to doubt, pointing to the unknown DNA and the absence of a body. The emotional climax came when the prosecutor delivered his closing statement. He walked the defense's closing argument was quieter but firm. The lawyer insisted that reasonable doubt remained. He repeated that Todd's testimony was unreliable, that DNA pointed to someone unknown, that the state could not show cause of death. He asked the jury not to let sympathy for Claire's family cloud their judgment. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The courthouse waited in silence. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, word came that they had reached a verdict. The gallery filled again. Family members clutched each other's hands. Reporters held cameras ready. The foreman stood and read the decision. Brian Keller, guilty of second-degree murder. Todd Jensen, guilty of being an accomplice and guilty of concealing evidence. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then Claire's mother broke into tears. Her daughter, now 23, hugged her tightly. For years they had stood by the lake, holding candles, begging for answers. Now, at last, justice had spoken. One reporter described the scene. The defense table still, Brian staring straight ahead, Todd looking down at his hands. At the prosecution side, quiet relief. And in the gallery, a family that finally had a verdict after almost 2 decades. The judge ordered Brian into custody immediately. He would face sentencing later, but the weight of the conviction was already final. Todd, too, was led away, his plea bargain saving him from the maximum penalty, but ensuring years in prison. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Some cheered. Others shook their heads, still unsettled by the questions left unanswered. The mysterious DNA profile had never been identified. Claire's body was never recovered. But the jury had found enough. Claire's mother addressed reporters with trembling words. "We waited almost 20 years for this." Justice came late, but it came. Her daughter spoke too. "I grew up in the dark. I grew up wondering if my mother had left me, if she was still alive. Now I know she never abandoned me. She was taken from me." June 2021. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Whitman family stood together by the shores of Bear River, not in silence or uncertainty, but in closure. A large memorial was organized in Claire's honor. The crowd was overwhelming. Hundreds of people from Logan and nearby towns gathered at the lake, the very place where her Ford Explorer had been hidden under layers of mud for 16 long years. They carried candles and flowers, forming a ring of light around the shoreline. For the family, it was a moment they had waited almost 20 years to see. Claire's mother stepped forward to speak. Her voice carried both pain and relief. "We waited almost 20 years for this." Justice came late, but finally, it came. Then her daughter, now 23, stood, with tears streaming down her face. She said, "My mother has been cleared of all the doubts. I can live the rest of my life knowing the truth has been brought into the light." The crowd fell silent. The image of mother and daughter holding each other, with the community surrounding them, became a powerful symbol of resilience and the long pursuit of justice. The emotional impact on Logan was immediate. For years, residents had lived with divided opinions, unanswered questions, and rumors. Now, with the trial concluded and a conviction delivered, there was relief, yet also sorrow. People admitted they felt both. They were grateful for clarity, but they could not forget that for 16 years, a dangerous man had walked freely among them. The wounds were visible, but at least the truth was finally established. At Logan Elementary School, where Claire had taught, staff and students created a permanent tribute. Her portrait was framed and placed in the main hall with the inscription, "In memory of Claire Whitman, never forgotten." For the teachers who had worked alongside her, it was a way to honor a colleague who had vanished so suddenly and whose case had haunted them for years. Every student who walked past that photo would see not only the face of a teacher, but also a reminder of what had been lost. Local churches also responded. They organized prayer services, gatherings, and community nights, focusing on faith, hope, and unity. Leaders emphasized that the lesson of the case was not only about loss, but also about strength. The strength of a family that never stopped demanding answers, and the strength of a community that stood with them. Vigils at the lake became an annual tradition. Every October, on the anniversary of Claire's disappearance, residents would gather by the water with candles, determined to keep her memory alive. What started as a desperate plea in the early years became a ritual of remembrance and solidarity. Beyond the emotional impact, the case left a deep mark on Utah's legal and investigative system. After the trial, the Utah Department of Justice announced a significant expansion of the state's cold case unit. Funding was increased specifically for advanced technology, modern sonar equipment to search waterways, and next-generation DNA testing that could analyze even the smallest, most degraded samples. Officials openly admitted that without sonar and forensic progress, the Bear River case would never have been solved. The case became a turning point in how authorities approached long unsolved disappearances. The Utah Police Academy also integrated the Whitman case into its training curriculum. Recruits were taught about the dangers of prematurely closing an investigation and the importance of re-examining cold cases as technology evolves. Instructors used the case to illustrate the cost of early errors and the value of persistence. It was no longer just a tragedy. It became a lesson for every future detective in the state. A new state policy soon followed. Cold cases older than 10 years must be reviewed at least once every 5 years with the latest available tools. It was a safeguard designed to prevent families from being left in limbo for decades. Lawmakers cited Claire's case directly in their proposals, arguing that if her file had been revisited sooner, answers might have come years earlier. While the change could not undo the suffering of the Whitman family, it ensured that other families might not have to wait as long. Yet even as the legal system took steps forward, one unresolved element lingered: the unidentified DNA found on the back seat of Claire's vehicle. Investigators had confirmed it did not belong to Claire or Brian. It raised the possibility that another man had been present that night. Prosecutors had chosen to focus on the strongest evidence against Brian, supported by Todd Jensen's confession. But the unexplained DNA left an open question. In Logan, debates continued. Some residents were convinced Brian had acted alone and the unknown DNA was irrelevant. Others believed it pointed to a hidden accomplice, a third man who had never been caught. Media outlets picked up the theory, and it became a topic of speculation on crime forums and in investigative journalism circles. The verdict brought closure, but not total clarity. For the Whitman family, however, the conviction of Brian Keller and Todd Jensen was enough. They no longer lived under the shadow of suspicion that Claire had abandoned her daughter or run away. Her name was restored. Her story had been told in full, and her innocence was confirmed. The relief was visible in every word her mother spoke, and in the steady presence of her daughter, who had grown from a frightened child left at school into a young woman standing proudly at her mother's memorial. The case also showed something larger. That tragedy can create change. Families across Utah who had long unsolved disappearances of their own felt encouraged. They saw that even after nearly 2 decades, answers could still be found. Communities began pressing law enforcement to re-examine their own cold cases, hoping sonar, DNA, or even a single overlooked witness could bring new breakthroughs. The Whitman case became a source of hope for those who had nearly given up. Nationally, the case gained attention as one of the most dramatic cold case resolutions of the decade. Documentaries were made. Crime shows covered it in detail. Journalists described it as both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking for the years lost, but inspiring for the perseverance that led to resolution. The name Bear River Mysteries stuck, not just in Utah but across the country. It became more than a case file. It became a piece of cultural memory. But for the people, the legacy was not limited to grief. Out of the tragedy came positive change. Families of victims felt less isolated. Police departments became more transparent. Lawmakers strengthened policies. And the state of Utah, once known for a cold case that seemed unsolvable, now became known for how technology and persistence finally brought justice. Still, the image that stayed with most people was simple. A mother and daughter reunited in memory, embraced by their community. The truth had been buried under water and mud for 16 years, but once uncovered, it changed everything. Logan would never be the same, and as the story of Claire Whitman closed, it left behind a question that echoed far beyond Bear River. How many other cases remain hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right technology, the right witness, or the right moment to bring the truth to light? For the Whitman family, the answer had finally come. For countless others, the search continues. And that is why stories like this must be told, so that the voices of the missing are not silenced, and so that justice, no matter how delayed, can still arrive. If you want to continue following stories like Claire's, and to help keep the memory of cold case victims alive, subscribe to the channel, share this story, and stay with us as we uncover more cases that still wait in the dark.